Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of our Towards Life 3.0 series. My name is Mathias Risse, and I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I am welcoming you also on behalf of Sushma Raman, our executive director, who will be joining us at the Q&A stage later on. Now, as many of you know, our series Towards Life 3.0, Ethics and Technology in the 21st Century has now been going on for a few years. And this is the first episode in this semester, spring semester 2021. The title of the series we are taking from Max Tegmark's wonderful book, Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. The goal of this series is to explore ethical and human rights related issues that arise in the course of the technological innovation that is happening all around us, and that might eventually take us to a full-fledged Life 3.0, a phase of life populated by entities that get to design both their culture, their software, so to speak, and their bodies, their hardware. So the idea is that Life 1.0 is the evolutionary life, where basically the individuals are born and then they don't do any learning on their own. They just execute what's in their DNA. So they shape neither their hardware nor their software. Then later on, we're getting Life 2.0, where individuals are still born into certain bodies that develop in certain genetically predetermined ways, but individuals are doing learning, and collectively there's learning. So the hardware is given, but the software, the culture is very much of in this case, human design. And if we come to Life 3.0, entities that will be with which we would be sharing as humans, our social and political spaces, might be entities that can then design both their hardware and their software. So we do of course not know if that kind of life will ever emerge or when, even though a lot of people in the know think that it might well happen sometime this century. But we also don't want to start thinking about its ethical dimensions only once it's clear that it will indeed emerge. And in any event, there are plenty of such challenges, ethical and human rights related challenges around technological innovation that are all around us already and that occur simply as part of that technological innovation. And that already takes me to our topic for today, which is Decolonizing AI, the challenges, opportunities, and the urgency of now. The decolonizing theme is one that we increasingly find in many contexts around university life, which I think is all for the better. The concern there is always to investigate how particular academic or also political or social niches have been shaped in ways that have involved pernicious social hierarchies, or how these niches themselves contribute to the maintenance of such hierarchies. One example that is currently very much in the news is the discipline of classics, the study of the ancient world. Concerns around decolonization in that particular field are about increasing research on the often rather ugly realities of what, after all, were slave-holding societies, the ancient societies, and then also about investigating how ideals and figures from the ancient world have all too often been enlisted to maintain white supremacist ideas of what contemporary societies should look like. So the concerns around decolonization that are happening in the field of classics now are around changing these parameters and also to coming to terms with the historical reality of those parameters. In the domain of artificial intelligence, which is the one that concerns us here, one theme in the decolonizing debate is that any specialized or general artificial intelligence that we build would have to do its learning drawing on data that often reflect our deeply racist past and present. Another theme is that much of the engineering and coding work done in that field is done by people with a rather homogeneous educational background and disproportionately by white men. A focus on these matters is urgent to make sure that technology is actually used to create a better world for everyone, rather than a world that encapsulates ever the same prejudices in technologically more sophisticated ways. And it is now my pleasure to welcome back our speaker for today, so the person who will actually talk to us about decolonizing AI, the challenges, opportunities, and the urgency of now. And that is Sabelo Mlambi, whose work is located at the intersection of human rights, ethics, culture, and technology. and whose work emphasizes both how the global south and marginalized communities in the north can benefit from certain technological innovations, but then also how technological innovation can benefit from perspectives from the global south and from marginalized communities in the global north. Sabelo is the founder of Bantocracy, a public interest organization which focuses on the Southern African ethical framework Ubuntu and its connection and its potential for use in the field of technological innovation. And he was one of the inaugural technology and human rights fellows at the Carr Center and has, in that capacity, also on several occasions addressed audiences through the Carr Center. And it's also worth noting that his paper, Sabelo's paper, From Rationality to Relationality, Ubuntu as an Ethical and Human Rights Framework for Artificial Intelligence Governance, that paper was actually the most downloaded Carr Center paper of 2020. So Sabelo Mlambi is very much the counterpart of a Carr Center best-selling author, as one might say. But now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sabelo Mlambi for his talk on decolonizing AI. And after the talk, we will have a Q&A session. Sushma will join us for that also. And you, the audience, should feel free. In fact, we very much encourage you to put your questions in the YouTube stream, and we will integrate them into our Q&A. We very much encourage you to be involved in this conversation. And with all that said, Sabelo, over to you.
Thank you so much, Matthias, for such a generous introduction. I truly appreciate it. And it's good to be back at one of my intellectual homes at the Carr Center. I truly had such a wonderful time that I spent in person with the Carr Center's folks and staff, and it was truly influential in my own research and growth. And so I would highly advise everyone to spend more time with this wonderful community. And so it's great to be here as well. And I would like to also thank my colleagues who are also joining, friends and family, who are also supporting me, and also my colleagues from the Africa group at Stanford University. It's good to have you all in the audience. So what I want to briefly talk about is this idea of decolonial AI, right? It's this new term that we've been hearing, and we've been hearing about, decolonizing AI, decolonizing technology. We've even had the terms that came before, such as data colonization. And then, so now we have this yet again, another term, another framing. So, what exactly does this even mean? And why decolonize AI? Why can't the other framings sort of give us, the language or the conceptual frameworks that we use? Is this even necessary? And is it even possible? Is it even doable? So there are these outstanding questions, and increasingly so, we're seeing that even different universities, are now pursuing, this question of decolonial AI and sort of decolonizing technology and the processes of even creating this. So, what exactly does that mean? Is there consensus? Are there issues? And why does it matter? And why should we sort of examine this question in this very present moment? Well, so I'm going to try just to talk briefly about this idea of decolonial AI and some of its central ideas, and why this question matters today, and some of its historical origins. Now, admittedly, I won't be able to go into all of the history in its entirety. The history is there. It's we should have, learned it in our studies. We know much of the history of colonization, the slave trade, and so forth. So I won't quite dwell a lot on that. But at the same time, it's going to be important to show how there's been a continuation over centuries that has brought us to this present day position that we're in, and that these events are not so isolated. Actually, they share the same structure, the same DNA, the same underlying value systems. And so to then try to better appreciate the moment we're in, or to try to even have an impact and to make some changes, we sort of have to kind of go back a little bit further, a little bit back, and then sort of look at that whole scenario, and then come to to the things that we can do now. So what is the central idea, right? What are some of these key core ideas? A central idea within decolonial AI, at least as I've come to understand it, is that we cannot take things, ideas, and concepts that are debated and decided upon in the abstract, maybe through statistical methods or rules of logic, and done so by a minority homogeneous class or ethnic group or country or nation, and then consider those ideas and concepts to be complete and not only complete, but that they are also equally beneficial when applied to human beings universally. The ideas often applied universally, they tend to have massive power inequalities that enable them, that are behind them. So decolonial AI then sort of begins to urge us to sort of refuse and refute the idea that there is just one way of viewing and approaching the world that produces the same benefits for everyone, right? Then this is an idea I'll definitely like to credit with some of my colleagues from Latin America. I think a lot of Paola Ricarte and Juan Ortiz, who talk about this idea of many universes in one. And later on, we'll get to some of the communities that are doing fantastic work in this movement. So it is not true that there's this central idea, this one way of seeing the world that gives equal benefits to everyone. And clearly, when we go back to history and look at the historical record and the historical account, we can see that much of the policies that we created, or designed in the abstract, were just designed for the purpose of exploration, extraction, commodifying, enslaving, and so forth and so forth and so forth. We cannot take ideas defined and designed in the abstract by this small homogeneous group and try to derive moral meaning or a sense of right and purpose from these ideas entirely in the abstract. And even more so, we cannot then take these ideas which were designed in the abstract and now try to apply them to human beings and just expect that these ideas will work beneficially for everyone. So decolonial AI tries to grapple with this question around the universal application of ideas, and it goes further to to stating that even as we look at now we have so many frameworks for doing ethical AI, and it's becoming really truly a buzzword and something that we're trying the community is actively engaging in, including countries have their own ethical AI frameworks. Now you have corporations and institutions suggesting this, but even corporations are also designing ethical AI and ethical research groups and so forth and so forth. But we should be wary of those again, because even as experiences that we can see from the how the tech companies are responding to the ethical researchers, especially the Black women who are doing such phenomenal work in the field of ethics and AI, how they're being treated. And so it does make us wonder then, really what is ethical, and what sense of ethics are they applying when they're thinking about AI. But nevertheless, what I want to emphasize though is that morality, ethics, or the worthiness of an intervention, maybe it's a framework, maybe it's a charter, or it's a group, whatever the worthiness of such intervention, it can be judged, it should be judged by its impact, again, on humans, on actual people. We can't decide these things in abstract, in isolation, and then try to apply them, whether it's a concept or this idea, and just because it makes sense to us. It's not enough for us to just take that and then apply it universally. We can even think of, for example, say, principles like equality, right? It could be possible to justify equality in the abstract sense, right? You just look at it logically, well, it sounds good, it looks good. Equality is applied to everyone the same. So, it has this appearance of being good and fit. But even that, it's still not enough. We need better ways to determine the correctness or the worthiness of an intervention. And so even with equality, it too must also be judged on on a different stance. What is the actual impact on people? What is the actual impact of applying an equal measure on people? In some cases, it might turn out that equality is not the solution. Instead, equity is the solution. In some instances, equity might have better impacts actually in its application than equality may have itself. And so then the idea again is that to do things in abstract and just then apply them universally without actually thinking about the direct effects on people, that's not enough. And we cannot continue with that legacy and that type of value system. The ideas that have had the greatest impact in shaping the modern world today have not been equally beneficial to everyone, even as they were applied universally. Globally, we can still observe massive inequalities, especially economic inequality between the rich and poor nations. And the rich nations, often those who became rich by creating economies, religious myths, fake pseudoscience, socialized racism, all designed around the purchase and sale of African bodies and the extraction of Africa's minerals and the seizure of African lands. And if we really think about decolonial AI, we have to really dwell with this question of colonization, because we can find some commonality there, which is what this emerging movement is trying to grapple with. The ultimate goal of colonization, at least if we frame it from Africa's traumatic encounter with the Europeans' modernity, it was truly the centralization of power and resources in the hands of a minority power elite, a minority group. In Africa's case, this marked the transfer of people and power and wealth to Europe and the Americas. And so we might say, well, this is in the past, right? So how does this apply to us today? This happened centuries ago. But if we look at it from a different lens, now if colonization, which lasted over 400 years, did end, then a good question is then why are political power, economic power, epistemic power, religious power, cultural power, technological power, and the power to determine universalisms and truths, why is all this power of the global markets, why is it still largely concentrated in the hands of the same groups, the same people, the same institutions that were the benefactors of colonization, right? So maybe the outward form may have changed, but then the effects are still present. The same power concentration that colonization aimed towards is still very well much here, present and alive. And this indicates that colonization in its effects and purposes has never ended. The massive power asymmetries that colonization aimed for have persisted, and they still linger with us. The experience and knowledge also acquired from centuries of subjugating much of the human population is still utilized and digitized to maintain the status quo. Now, it could be argued that if there's one thing that Western modernity is quite good at, it's probably creating these massive inequalities, intricately using subversion, overt and covert means and measures, spreading inequality and keeping the cycle of inequality ongoing and endless. And these methods and means heightened and strengthened for almost 500 years are meant to dehumanize those whose power is seen as disposable and those whose resources are seen as for the taking. And it could be argued that truly, if humans are equal in essence, meaning that they are of the same origin, they are the human race, then the way to really make someone unequal is to first dehumanize them. And so we see this legacy of dehumanization ongoing. The argument, therefore, of decolonial AI in this case is that the production and use of artificial intelligence and everything else that goes into that process, it cannot so easily escape this violent, intricate matrix of subjugation that is centuries old without the direct confrontation of these continued inequalities. And nevertheless, decolonial AI does have some good news or some inspiration, because while this subjugation and oppression was taking place for almost 500 years, um, the world's oppressed have also been developing movements of resistance. They found ways to sort of resist the complete destruction of their spirits and humanity. And oppressed groups have found ways to resist and to organize and to improve their situation, even if it's just bit by bit. And one of the ideas of decolonial AI is that we can also learn from these movements, just as surveillance capitalism or even capitalism itself built on the sale, of Black bodies, and so forth. Just as all of these institutions of racism, scientific racism, and other means that were used to subjugate and create the social order we have today, just as those have been developed for centuries to become at the heightened level they're at now, we too also have counter movements that also have existed from the very first, slave revolts that occurred in the 1400s, in the 1500s, and we can learn from these movements as well, and we can sort of build upon those movements and learn those lessons. We can learn from the abolition movement, the civil rights era, the Black Power, Black Panther movements, the anti-apartheid movement in Southern Africa. We can learn from the anti-colonial independence movements in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, in the Asias. We can learn from all of these historical examples, and we can learn from those lessons, what worked, what didn't work, and we can learn even from the even more recent examples that we can see. There's much work that's been done, for example, in how the newly freed African nations, what happened to their economies once they began to accept wholesale the advice of Western financial institutions, and how they're forced to deregulate the economies and so forth, and how much poverty that caused within the continent. We can learn from all of these movements, and decolonial AI picks up on that idea that we don't have to look far and to imagine different ways of trying to decolonize. We can see what worked, and we can find movements that worked, and we can learn from them, learn from the mistakes, and learn from some of the successes that those movements caused. But then, of course, that puts a requirement on this community, on the tech and human rights community, on people looking at the intersection of race and the intersection of technology, looking at the global South and how it relates to technology. It puts it makes it more required for us to really examine these historical colonial legacies and how they now shape and affect the world today. So, knowing just a bit more about the history or the purpose of decolonial AI and what decolonial AI, well, what really makes it urgent now, and why and how is decolonial AI actually feasible? Is it feasible, right? There are some unanswered questions there, because even decolonial AI, what exactly are we trying to decolonize? And there's a varying degree of what that could even mean. However, there are some movements right now that are definitely investigating this question around decolonial AI and the urgency of now. You have movements in Sub-Saharan Africa, movements in Latin America, movements across the global South. And the really interesting thing is that there is a soon coming point where these movements will begin to unite and begin to merge and to sort of form a strong, formidable force. And so, with that type of alliance, how feasible is decolonial AI? Well, it's more feasible under those circumstances, and I'll talk more a little bit later about those movements. But one central thing, I think, to really highlight the urgency of now, why does it even matter how we, this whole idea or impact of artificial intelligence and society, and how it worsens, racism and the effects of racism, and so forth and so forth and so forth. There are many reasons that have been widely, talked about in literature, and I won't be able to go into those reasons, but I'd like to suggest another reason that may not receive as much attention, and that is to say that really the greatest danger of artificial intelligence and why it needs to be decolonized and what that even means is based on the actual social role that artificial intelligence plays. So how we view artificial intelligence and how we view, its worth in society and its power to direct us on how to act or decide on decisions that have a human impact. That's what truly matters. Artificial intelligence, really, if looked at from a different lens, it's just another way to justify the unfair distribution of power and resources. It gives us a tool. It gives us something we can point to and say, well, the AI says that we should do such and such and such and such. And the AI is neutral, right? That's the idea that some have mistakenly believed. And so therefore the AI says we should do this, and therefore, we should go along with that. And that's really dangerous. That's really dangerous to have AI play as a source of truth on what decisions should be made that affect human beings, especially economically. Today, artificial intelligence, as many of us know, can be used to determine who gets advertising for better housing, who gets better healthcare, who receives better loan rates, who should be given bail, and who should remain in jail without bail, right? These are decisions that artificial intelligence can help us to make, but they have real economic impact on people. And if we're careful, we might be justifying the continued harms to groups that are already marginalized and oppressed. So yes, definitely, truthfully, artificial intelligence is increasingly being used to justify the distribution of resources and power within society. But we've had the same relationship in history before. Before artificial intelligence, it was scientific racism, that Europeans were better and more genetically fit to rule the world and to civilize others. And so Europeans were therefore somehow entitled to then go and extract resources and power from everyone else. And this, of course, led to the eugenics movement in the United States, and also the establishment of statistics, which is, of course, very influential in the creation of machine learning. And it also might be useful to point out that, even the whole, the computing, to point out how the computing industry and the internet and all this technology, how it also was developed from like a military point of view, from the army, from military operations, and was sort of meant for violence and also to subjugate other people. The idea that some ethnicities are undesirable and some people are inherently less human and must be reduced in population or killed entirely, these are very much American ideas and part of US history. And again, scientific racism, it served as a source of truth, designating how power and resources should be concentrated in society. And it was meant to serve your American interest. Before that, we had philosophical racism. The idea that, for example, Africans were not rational, were not intelligent to the same level as Europeans, and therefore were less human. It was thought that colonization would help to bring the non-European to a state of higher being, to a state of being rational. And the Enlightenment philosophers, many of them were proponents of racism, and they directly supported the slave trade of African people, and they supported colonization. Again, their philosophies were used to justify the distribution of power and society. And again, this was meant to really serve the interest of, Euro-American interest. And then the cycle goes on. And in another era, it was religion, the idea that God, the angels, and divinity were all white, and that God chose Europeans and Americans to Christianize the world and to act as parents of the unchristianized world, from the Roman Church giving trade charters and colonial charters to European powers for them to control the trade routes or to colonize the lands of those who didn't worship the same way that Europeans did, or to practice the same religion that Europeans did. Once again, this was another tool, just another, placeholder used again to justify the distribution of power and resources within society. So in every era, in every instance, in every case, it's always about the distribution of power and resources and within society. And I think in some ways, artificial intelligence plays its same role. It's increasingly used to justify how power and distribution of how the distribution of power and resources should be in society. And so, if we're not careful, then we can then we will continue then to perpetuate these inequalities and and to justify them by having sort of an uncritical approach to artificial intelligence. And so, and even maybe one day we will never reach the AI 3.0 where computers become sort of as intelligent, if that's even possible, as humans. Maybe we may not reach that, and even if we don't reach that point, there will always be, if we're not careful, to dismantle this relationship now. And now the force will come into play, another system that will be used again to justify the distribution of power and resources within society. And it'll just be used to justify inequality. It'll be used to justify who should be sentenced to jail, who should not get a loan, who should not have financial power, who should not have economic power. So that is probably in my assessment that it's the greatest danger that artificial intelligence also fits perfectly into this role, and how it justifies the distribution of power and resources within society. So then we have the urgency, which is now to try to break this cycle, right? And that's and I would like to suggest that decolonial AI is also in some ways aiming towards this idea to break this cycle, because if we don't break it, it's going to repeat itself in a different way, in different patterns and in different forms. But if we can identify that, really what we're dealing with is the unfair concentration of power and resources in society, then we must do something different. Now, of course, this has different implications, because one a popular view that we find from the African continent, especially when it comes to the idea of human rights. I think of the South African philosopher Magobe Ramose, who talks about that without economic equality, to really try to bring globalization or the human rights projects into the continent, it's really a limited, it's really an attempt that can never really have the most meaningful results. And there's critiques that that even the frameworks themselves, they're really meant for a limited case, maybe the most extreme measures of inhumane treatment. But then what about the majority of the world, whose probably the main issue is economic equality or economic inequality, which was directly caused from centuries of subjugation and oppression? What frameworks are there to help them? What frameworks are there to advocate for a new redistribution of power and resources in society? So really, we're dealing with the centralization of power and resources in society that is now being justified by the use of artificial intelligence. So this is another sort of component that I think decolonial AI is trying to grapple with. Now, so again, then, okay, so knowing this, what are the practical challenges to accomplishing what decolonial AI tries to aim for? Not just within artificial intelligence, not just within the world of AI, but also within society, within our institutions, within the world. So what are these practical challenges that we're dealing with today within the community? And some of that relates to organizing. There are different movements happening sort of asynchronously throughout the African continent, throughout Latin America. I think of Tierra Común, which is really growing in Latin America, and the non-aligned AI movement, which is also emerging, which tries to, in some ways, mirror the idea that the racialized groups of the world and the global South population and people, they really don't want to adopt the necessarily so to be forced to adopt the Western model of AI, which could be surveillance capitalism and so forth, the codification of their data, but they also don't want to maybe adopt even say the Eastern model of AI, where you're heavily surveilled to, even control your social behavior in the, in the physical life and so forth. But they want to use artificial intelligence to work for their own needs that they've identified, maybe inspired and led by indigenous values, led by indigenous communities, by local knowledge systems. Um, uh, so there's some of other movements that are happening as well in Latin America. There's some, of course, in the Black community that are really exciting. Folk from Black in AI, Masakane in South Africa, actually throughout the continent. But it does present some challenges in trying to sort of come together and find commonality, because you have variety of different cultures, different worldviews, and trying to find the common points where we can sort of work together and try to aim towards this decolonial process. But another practical challenge, though, is then again, well, if we're decolonizing, at least in the context of big tech, the big tech companies, are we asking these companies to be a little bit nicer, right? To, maybe have, less data collection, for example, or are we just trying to say, let's just disrupt their entire business models, right? The entire, how they make money and the incentives that allow these companies to feel the need to surveil and to commodify user data. So again, to what extent is decolonizing AI actually, aiming to, right? What type of world are we trying to build? Is it a new one altogether, or is it one with just some, minor adjustments here and there? But there's also another greater danger, which ironically comes from the academic world and even some of the big tech companies, in that there is also a danger to sort of co-opt the terminology of decolonizing AI or decolonizing technology, decolonizing society. And the danger there is that decolonization means different things to different people. There are present people today who have lived with the actual ramifications of being politically and economically colonized. People who lived through the revolution and the independence movements of for example, Southern Africa. I can think of my own family that was involved in the colonial fights, where they became, they became activists and soldiers, and they actually were fighting for, to free themselves from being colonized. So, this terminology means different things to different people and has a different sentiment. So then, when we now have sort of academics and especially Western institutions now also, joining the conversation, or using the term for maybe even instances where it might not fully or perfectly apply, then we have to ask, and then we have to wonder then as well, is there a risk to lose this conceptual framework that seems to work for the moment, right? Will we forever have to continue sort of trying to find new terms and new words to describe, this historical pattern that still continues today? So there is a danger against that, having the terminology taken by others and even diluted, and even, to have the movement sort of, done away with just by dilution and the distraction. So there are some practical challenges there. With how to actually accomplish the colonial AI. However, there are definitely, but these challenges, they do present some really good opportunities themselves, because in some sense, the community, especially in the global South, especially racialized communities, are becoming more united and more organized and more aware of these events, of the impact of technology in their own lives, and they're now becoming more working towards that. But at the same time, we also find that the impact of of artificial intelligence in society and how it worsens the existing inequalities, not just for Black communities and so forth, but also for other people. The philosopher Achille Mbembe from Cameroon, he talks about how the entire world is sort of turning Black, in the sense that the same methods apply to Black people are now being applied to everyone. And so to some extent, there is like this global growing consciousness that, there's something wrong with the system. And, as we begin to tap into that and to connect those missing dots and points together, I think it presents a really powerful opportunity to try to confront these historic realities that we've had for the past century. So, yeah, I think we can leave it at that, and then open it up for any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Sabelo, for joining us today and for your remarks. Always a pleasure and honor to hear from you. And, I'm going to take a step back to the work that you had done when you were at the Carr Center with your research on Ubuntu and the use of Ubuntu philosophy as an ethical and human rights framework for AI governance. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that, because is it adequate to, improve the accuracy of AI tools or to expand diversity in technology? Or do we really need to think about this in a new way with new business models, increased focused on social imperatives and new governance? So it would be terrific to hear from you about your work on Ubuntu.
Thank you so much, Sushma. Yes, the main point there with the work that I did on Ubuntu really is that, and I thank my colleague for Paola again, who helped me to realize this even more, is the idea of combating epistemic injustice, right? The idea that one society can sort of build the truths of the world and to shape those truths and to determine how we should approach and relate to the world. And so Ubuntu is then sort of trying to do the reverse of that, trying to say that, the world which we've been given by force and by violence has really been, in its conception, has been meant towards the benefit of certain groups, of certain people, usually the Western world, specifically West Europe and then in America. And so therefore, it's the idea that, we sort of reject those ideas, fundamentally reject them, because one, they were not applied universally because they were more appropriate or that they had a better fit. They were not. One, they were illogical, number one. Two, same thing, they were irrational. And three, they were built to support racism and the colonization of other groups. So in every instance, these ideas themselves were flawed, and the basis which I try to trace back was at the Carr Center during my research was, where can we pinpoint that breakdown where we can say this is sort of like the foundational point where we can maybe start to make an impact. And then, in that essence, and that point for me was in how the human being was defined. From the very first instance, the human being was defined in a way that was just wrong, and in a way really meant to support the intentions of European imperialism. That's how that the version of human being, the definition was defined, and then it was defined in such a way, and then actually society was then built around the definition, right? It was the economy, racial stereotypes, social norms, political norms and so forth were then designed around this idea of this supposedly rational individual, this self-complete individual. And so Ubuntu then challenges that at the very core, because even in its etymology, Ubuntu means being human, how to be human. So it's meant to challenge really how we perceive what it means to be human. And so then if we then challenge that idea of being human, and sort of find better definitions for what being human means, then we can then build societies around the definition of what it means to be a person, societies that are more generous, that are more equal, where there's less economic insecurity, where we can have better relations through human beings throughout society. So that was essentially the work. And yes, so which does talk about, you mentioned diversity and inclusion, and the idea there is that diversity is often being asked to fit into like a Eurocentric world. It's often being asked to, hey, this is your place, this is your spot on the table, it's this spot right there, just fit in there and only operate within those means. But it's never really to say, well, how about we just maybe dismantle a Eurocentric worldview? How about we just maybe move on from that type of thinking and have a totally different world, a world where we can have multiple universes within sort of like the same ecosystem, where we can have multiple ways of seeing the world. And Ubuntu also advocates for that, in the sense that we must allow others to sort of join the community and to bring them in and to expand the community around their needs, and to allow the other person to be able to have meaningful power, to have themselves truly represented, not just to have this universal view that we then, this biased, one-sided universal view that we end up applying to the rest of the world. So Ubuntu also can help us have that conceptual framework of thinking about diversity, inclusion, governance, artificial intelligence, what it means to be a human, what it means to have computers that are human-like. It can help us sort of grapple with that.
Thank you, Sabelo. So let me pick up on one question from the audience. The question reads, many programming languages are English-based. Are there examples of non-English-based programming languages that are, or that you hope will gain traction in decolonizing AI by decolonizing language? And if I may just elaborate a little bit on that, because I think it goes also very much to the heart of the question of what does decolonizing actually mean for the actual execution of computer science as a discipline and as a practice. So if you just think about that historically, right? So the UK and the US were simply the major locations for where computer science was founded and developed originally in the 30s, 40s. Then it's a famous meeting in Dartmouth in the late 50s, where the term AI was coined around a group of people who thought they could, within a few decades, figure out how to emulate the brain and all of that. So there's kind of a deep connection in the field of computer science to English-speaking countries, which of course is reflected, among other things, in the development of programming languages, which has largely gone unquestioned with the global supremacy of English as a communications language. How does your thinking, Sabelo, around decolonization handle the supremacy of English also in the world of programming languages?
That is a really good question. I think the main idea at play is that language is used to communicate values, ideas, and to share knowledge, and it's used for the production of knowledge. And certain languages have certain constraints within them that maybe are culturally based and culturally biased as well. In fact, let me just maybe avoid the coding question for a little bit, and even talking about the actual alphabets, for example, that are used within the formerly colonized world. For example, within the African continent, if you look at the Bantu languages and look at the Roman scripts that are used to symbolize those languages, they're so inadequate. They don't capture the actual differences in tone, how one word spelled one way can actually mean two different things based on the tone, based on the accent. And this creates a lot of difficulty in writing in African languages. There's been studies shown, for example, that reading a Zulu paragraph and then reading an English paragraph is the same paragraph. It takes you maybe twice as long or 3 times as long just to read, because some words you have like 4 letters just for like one sound, and you have like multiple, and some words, if you're very clever, you can write the same paragraph. You can write a paragraph that can have 2 completely different meanings, because you cannot see the accent marks or the tonality that's there. And so the danger with only just purely English coding languages is that one, they've been developed with the terminology and the culture of the Western world. You find a lot of references, for example, about, master slave terminology. Maybe you have a master database and slave workers, or you find words like blacklisting and whitelisting. What are you, blacklisting, of course, is like the bad words or the bad, and whatever and so forth. And then some of these languages may not even quite capture how different societies conceptually organize or like model the world, and so they're definitely insufficient. Let me end by saying that there's a book called African Fractals that talks about like how the binary system there's evidence that it made its way from sub-Saharan Africa all the way to Europe, which eventually was adopted by the European mathematicians and so forth, which then eventually became the digital language that we use today for computers. And within the system, with the binary system, you find the ideas in computer science such as recursion, such as fractals, and the author of the book, who's now a professor at the University of Michigan, Ron Aglash, he was writing that in some of these languages, or in some of these cultures, they already have the intuitive ideas of recursion and fractals. It's in the language, it's in the culture, it's in how they build the architecture. So in other words, we might even be able to build computing languages that can maybe better model some types of problems much better than just a simply English-based language. It might give us a greater expression. And last thing is that I was at a conference at UCLA recently on African languages and philosophy, and one of the presenters had noted that some of the greatest advancements in linguistics in the past 20, 30 years have been centered on the study of African languages. And so what can we learn in how these people describe concepts? Could that be more useful for the computing age? Who knows? But I think that's a good research question.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. What is the role of policymakers in decolonizing AI? You mentioned moving from the theoretical to the practical, but no perfect solution. What criteria should policymakers use?
I'm not even too sure how to respond to that. What I can share is that I've done some work, for example, where I've working alongside the UN, have advised policymakers in different African countries on how to create ethical AI frameworks. And so what policymakers can do is to really better engage with the community, especially the African community, they're in Africa, of course, but to better engage with the greater community that is studying these effects of artificial intelligence in society and the decolonial effects. Because decolonization is a multifaceted approach. It's not enough to just have people exploring the ethics of AI be the ones really leading the discussion, but it should be everyone, historians, sociologists, diviners, even economists, and all of this getting together. Because so what Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana in 1967, in his book, he talks about how colonization is, he talks about actually the perpetuation of colonization is such an intricate process, right? It's not like a one-stop shop where if we just do this one thing, we're able to get we will be able to decolonize, our nations or societies. But there's just so many things from, the culture that's produced, the media, the influences, the histories, the technology. I mean, it's like such a very intricate process, which requires the active participation of everyone in society. So probably, without, having too much knowledge there to share, is that an approach that could work well is to have sort of a group of people diverse in their experiences and their expertise who can talk about these issues and understand them from a decolonial framework, and to really pinpoint really this underlying issue, how whatever the inequality is, whatever the cause is, at least for the systematic inequalities, we can tie it also to like, the continuation of the centralization of power and resources within society, stemming back from legacies of colonization.
Let me bring up one other question from the audience. This one is actually about changes in the technology and ethics curriculum, lessons to be drawn from that. So the question is, I'm curious about the consequences for technology, for the technology ethics curriculum often run by philosophy departments. Could you discuss a few issues you think would be ideal for discussion in engineering classrooms? So what is the advice that you give to educators in the classroom on these issues?
Yeah, for any minority person who's been through a computer science curriculum or in the engineering school, it's an isolating experience. And then you leave that experience to go work in the tech world, which is also a very isolating experience. And that's just a pattern. Minority, racialized groups, I should say, and even women who, or anybody who's not a male, working in that industry, it's very isolating, and you're usually the only one, or the only one out of two, or out of three, and so forth. So it is isolating. So I think one thing that we could do to at least within the academic world to sort of talk about these issues of ethics and AI and even decolonization is one, to make sure that others feel like they do belong, right? The early computer scientists, many of them were women, right? So that is a part of their legacy and history. A lot of the computing methods that we find in computing can also be traced or find similarities within the African continent. And we can also acknowledge that as well and show people that it's not just this homogeneous white individual, super male, individualistic culture that has created the internet and what it is today. Some of these advances have been built on the labor of women, have used other knowledge systems from Africa. I mean, the binary system came from African divination. Like, these are diviners, right? You wouldn't think of them as scientists and mathematicians, but we can show how some parts of computing can be traced, or we can find similarities in other parts of the world. And also, when we then bring in the philosophy department, like many schools are now starting to do, I think the issue there is that we almost often, when we talk about ethics, we never question what ethics we're talking about. We immediately assume that maybe it's like some Western form of ethics. And then, and I think that's a problem, because there are other ethical systems that might give us better results as well. So when we talk about ethics and AI within the classroom, are we highlighting different ethical systems and what their implications would be towards building technology? Are we also making the students who normally don't feel represented by design or by culture or by whatever the issue is, are we then including them as well and showing them that, yes, they do have a history in this field, they've made important contributions in this field, and that, therefore they can also feel as like, even like owners of this computing legacy.
Thank you, Sabelo. I'll turn back to Sushma in a moment, who will wrap up. But since you mentioned in passing that many of the earlier programmers were women, I just want to give a concluding shout out here to who arguably was the very first programmer in the world, namely Ada Lovelace, from in the 19th century, right? So who has been restored to some recognition in recent times, but who deserves to be even much broader known. So first 19th century, this is when Charles Babbage did some, way before his time, sort of work on creating a model for a computer. And Ada Lovelace basically was the math mind who figured out how to actually work with that. And in that sense, I think deserves the honor of being the world's first programmer, who in fact was a woman. That just deserves to be said, and an echo of one point that you made, Sabelo. So thank you for that. And I turn over to Sushma now for finishing us up.
Thank you again, Sabelo, for joining us today. And thank you to our audience for joining us and for following the work of the Carr Center. Our next event in this series will feature Dr. Alexa Koenig of the University of California at Berkeley, who's the executive director of the Human Rights Center, and she'll be talking about digital witnesses, ethical challenges in online human rights investigations. More information about our series Towards Life 3.0 and our other talk series can be found on our website, carcenter.hks.harvard.edu. Thank you for joining.